The city pulsed with life beneath a curtain of twilight, skyscrapers etched in gold by the setting sun as it retreated behind the jagged skyline of Manhattan. On rooftops and alleyways alike, shadows deepened, but so too did the stories whispered through every brick and window pane. Above it all, a solitary figure perched upon a steel girder, his silhouette framed by the glow of the horizon. Peter Parker, the boy who became a legend. He had not asked for the bite that changed him. In a moment of curiosity and fate, a radioactive spider sank its fangs into the skin of an awkward teenage science student during a school trip to Oscorp. Pain followed, then fever, then inexplicably power. Walls no longer resisted his grip. Reflexes sharpened, senses heightened, and strength surged through limbs once too clumsy to catch a football in gym class. He was not a god. He was something else entirely. At first, he used his powers selfishly. Fame beckoned, money glinted. Wearing a mask for wrestling gigs, he wowed crowds and turned heads. But arrogance has a way of becoming its own punishment. When he let a criminal slip past him with a shrug, that same man would murder his beloved Uncle Ben. And in the silent aftermath of gunfire and sirens, Peter learned a truth that would define every moment henceforth. With great power, there must also come great responsibility. The city became his burden and his sanctuary. Swinging through the canyons of steel and glass, he was both phantom and protector. He battled monsters of science and madness alike. The twisted genius of Otto Octavius, whose mechanical limbs turned him into Dr. Octopus. The scorned scientist Kurt Connors, who became the savage lizard, Norman Osborn, his best friend's father, torn apart by the duality of ambition and insanity as the Green Goblin. Each villain he faced was more than a foe. They were mirrors of what Peter could become if he gave in to despair or vengeance. They were cautionary tales draped in violence and tragedy. And through every battle, every fall, he rose again not as a symbol, but as a man trying to do right in a world that rarely rewarded it. Even love was a battlefield. Mary Jane Watson, whose laughter echoed through his memories, and Gwen Stacy, whose fall from a bridge changed him forever. These were the names carved deepest into his heart. Loss and joy wove together in his life like the threads of a web, each one strengthening and straining in turn. The city changed, and so did he. The black suit, born of alien origin, once amplified his strength and darkened his soul, teaching him that power without compassion was a hollow triumph. From it came venom, an echo of his darker self given monstrous form. And still, Peter fought, not just with fists, but with hope. As years passed, Peter matured, teaching science, mentoring new heroes, and forging alliances with the likes of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. Yet no matter how far the legend spread, he remained the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, a figure darting across rooftops with banter on his lips and duty in his heart. Through multiversal chaos, alternate versions of himself emerged. Miles Morales with electric flair and fresh eyes, Gwen Stacy reborn as Spider-Woman, and others beyond imagination. Together, they reminded him that being Spider-Man wasn't about who wore the mask, but what they stood for. He was never the strongest, never the richest, never the most revered. But in the darkness, in the silence between cries for help and the leap into action, he remained steadfast. Because in the heart of Peter Parker, behind the sorrow and sacrifice, burned an unyielding desire to protect, to serve, to carry the weight of those who could not. Spider-Man was not a title, it was a promise. And every night, as the web sang through the air and boots touched glass high above the world, he kept that promise. Because someone had to. Rain fell in silver sheets across the rooftops of Queens, tracing lines down windows that glowed with the warmth of quiet families and late dinners. Somewhere amidst the comforting hum of normalcy, Peter Parker sat alone in his apartment, nursing a bruised rib and a heart heavy with memories. Heroism came at a cost, and in that moment, it weighed more than any enemy's blow. A soft knock at the door interrupted his solitude. It was May, her eyes gentle but knowing. She never asked where he went at night, but she always knew when he returned different, sore, exhausted, quiet. Her embrace reminded him of what he fought for. The people who never saw the battle, only the peace it bought. But the peace never lasted. Trouble brewed again and again, boiling over in new forms. Electro, once Max Dillon, was a man whose loneliness became lightning. Craving attention and validation, he turned his pain into chaos, surging through the city with volts of vengeance. Peter tried to reach him, not just fight him, but rage often drowns reason. Then came Kraven the Hunter, a predator who sought Spider-Man not as a man, but as prey. In the jungle of Manhattan, Kraven turned the hunter's code into a cruel game, seeking not to defeat, but to destroy Peter's spirit. Their battle became a test of will, of identity. Peter emerged not because he was stronger, but because he refused to become the beast his foe expected. There were moments of light, too, times when the mask came off and he allowed himself to smile. He shared laughter with Mary Jane, took photos for the Bugle with wit sharp enough to rival J. Jonah Jameson's fury, and found solace in friendship with Harry Osborn, though shadows always lingered in that bond. For every joy, a storm loomed. One such storm came in the form of the Sinister Six, a coalition of his greatest enemies. Their union was born not of camaraderie but shared hatred. Doc Ock, Vulture, Electro, Sandman, Mysterio, and Rhino, each powerful in their own right, but devastating together. The city trembled under their assault, and Peter stood alone between them and disaster. He fought with every ounce of strength, not to win glory, but to protect lives. Buildings crumbled, illusions shattered, and pain surged through him like a tidal wave. But he endured because that is what Spider-Man does. He gets back up. Even when Harry, twisted by the legacy of his father, donned the mantle of the Goblin, Peter did not give up on him. Their final confrontation beneath a moonlit sky was more than a clash of blades and bombs. It was a cry for redemption, a plea to remember the boy he once called brother. Time marched forward. Peter's body bore the scars of countless battles, and his soul carried even more. Yet he continued, not because he was fearless, but because he knew fear too well, kept him grounded, human. And as Miles Morales grew into his powers, Peter saw something extraordinary. Hope, not just for the city, but for the future of Spider-Man. Miles was different, unique, and brave in his own right. Peter mentored him not as a successor, but as an equal. The legacy expanded, not diluted. Gwen, Miguel O'Hara from the future, Penny Parker, and even Spider-Ham, each brought a piece of the spider mythos into new worlds. In the threads connecting them all, Peter saw that he was never truly alone. But at his core, Peter remained the boy from Queens who believed one person could make a difference. No matter the multiverse, no matter the mask, that truth endured. The wind howled outside his window as he stood and pulled the suit over fresh wounds. Somewhere, someone needed help. And as always, he would answer. Because he was Spider-Man. Because someone had to. The night was unusually quiet. The hum of the city softened by a low-hanging fog that blurred the streetlights into floating orbs. Above the haze, Peter swung from building to building with practiced ease, his mind racing faster than his web lines. Even after all these years, the city had a rhythm, a living, breathing heartbeat he could feel in his bones. And tonight, something in that rhythm felt off. There had been whispers, a return, a presence Peter hadn't encountered in years. The Kingpin. Wilson Fisk had never needed superpowers. His empire was built on fear, manipulation, and control. After his public fall and brief incarceration, he'd vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a vacuum of chaos. But the city always remembered him, and now that familiar unease had crept back into the streets. Rumors of buyouts, disappearances, and silent wars between gangs weren't just crime. They were signals. Peter followed those signals deep into the underbelly of Manhattan, into abandoned subway tunnels and crumbling warehouses, where echoes of past battles still lingered. He found men with strange tech, enhanced suits, cloaking devices, cybernetic implants. Someone was arming the underworld again, and it wasn't just Fisk. Someone new was pulling strings. It led him to a name he hadn't heard before: the Rose, a criminal tactician with a network as wide as Fisk's, but with the patience of a chess master. And unlike Fisk, who ruled through fear, the Rose built loyalty that made him dangerous in a whole new way. Juggling this new mystery, Peter was also navigating the fragile line between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. Teaching science by day, fighting crime by night, and trying to support Aunt May through her health struggles, he often felt the weight of every mask he wore. But in quiet moments, Mary Jane reminded him why he kept going. Her voice, her belief in him, kept the doubt at bay. Then came a night that changed everything again. Tear in the sky. At first, it was a shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt. But then it widened, spiraling open with a pulse of unstable energy. From it came beings not of this earth, variants of villains he had once fought. A six-armed Dr. Octopus, a Sandman who could control stone, a green goblin whose laughter carried the echoes of entire dead timelines. The multiverse was bleeding. Doctor Strange arrived through a portal of his own, robes fluttering like storm clouds. He explained the growing instability, a rift caused by too many crossings, too many alterations. The Spider-Verse was collapsing in on itself. Peter was swept into another war, one fought not just across rooftops, but between realities. He met other versions of himself again, older, younger, scarred in ways he couldn't imagine. They stood together against the threat, not just of destruction, but of forgetting entire lives, entire universes lost to the unraveling threads. They fought on the edge of the void, webbing together collapsing dimensions, holding back entropy with sheer will. And in the end, Peter made a choice. To save the multiverse, he had to let go of something he loved. A memory, a version of MJ, one he had grown close to in another world, where life had worked out, where she wore the ring and they had a daughter. He watched it fade from his grasp, her hand reaching for his as reality snapped back into place. She smiled, even as she vanished, and whispered, "Thank you." When he awoke, back in his own bed, he felt the loss like a phantom limb. But he rose, because grief was not the end of the story. Back in his own world, peace held for a moment longer. He helped Miles train, watched Gwen return to her own universe stronger, wiser. He rebuilt bridges burned by battle, extended kindness to villains trying to change, and never stopped swinging. He was Peter Parker. He was Spider-Man, and the city still needed him. Always would. And he would be there, because someone had to. Morning broke over New York City with the hush of light rain and the soft glow of 1,000 waking windows. On the edge of a water tower, Spider-Man watched the sunrise through his cracked lenses, the city's heartbeat thudding gently beneath him. He didn't need a break. He needed purpose. And as always, it wasn't long before it found him. The Daily Bugle headline screamed in red, "New threat in Midtown. Who is the Spider-Wasp?" Peter's brow furrowed. He hadn't heard that name before. That usually meant one of two things. Someone new was in town trying to make a name, or someone old had found a new identity. Either way, it spelled trouble. The Spider-Wasp turned out to be a vigilante, a teenager operating with similar powers, but driven by a far more aggressive sense of justice. Their webbing was lined with micro-stingers, paralyzing foes instead of trapping them. Their tactics were brutal, efficient. Criminals were ending up in hospitals, sometimes comatose. Peter confronted them one night beneath the scaffolding of a construction site. The spider wasp was fast, confident, and angry. Their voice, distorted through a modified mask, rang with frustration. "You pull your punches. You let them go. They come back. They always come back." Peter didn't argue. He simply said, "We don't do this to punish. We do this to protect." But that wasn't enough for Spider Wasp. They vanished into the dark, leaving Peter with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Oscorp was stirring again. Norman Osborn, long thought dead or missing, had resurfaced in whispers and stock movements. A new company had emerged. Hexatech, a biotech startup built atop Oscorp's buried research. Their mission, at least publicly, was healing, advanced regeneration, neural repair, limb reconstruction. But in the shadows, they were experimenting with hybrid technology. Man and machine, flesh and code. Peter investigated undercover as a consultant, using his scientific credentials to gain access. He saw things that chilled him: clone spines enhanced with symbiote tissue, synthetic limbs powered by spider DNA, and deep in the lab, a prototype AI interface called Athena, designed to map and predict hero behavior. They were building countermeasures, not for villains, for heroes. One night, breaking deeper into their secured systems, Peter discovered the files labeled Project Siren. The data detailed predictive models designed to expose secret identities, track movement patterns, and simulate ethical breakdowns in high-stress scenarios. Athena was not only learning heroes, it was preparing to replace them. Then, everything changed. The spider wasp infiltrated Hexatech first, believing them responsible for a personal tragedy. In the process, they triggered a lockdown, alerting Athena and activating the prototype, a synthetic hero called Proxy, built from carbon fiber mesh and combat AI. Proxy adapted instantly to Spider Wasp's fighting style, and when Peter joined the fight, it adapted to his too. For the first time in a long time, Peter felt outmatched. Proxy didn't get tired. It didn't feel pain. It calculated every move before he made it. Only by forcing Athena into a logic loop, reminding it that heroes act unpredictably because they feel and care, was he able to freeze it long enough to destroy the core. Hexatech burned that night, but not without consequences. The spider wasp was unmasked, revealing a teenager named Eliza Mendez. Her brother had been caught in a crossfire months ago, paralyzed by a stray bullet during a clash between Spider-Man and Shocker. Her pain had become purpose, but without guidance, it had hardened into rage. Peter offered her something else: mentorship, patience, redemption. It wouldn't be easy, but he saw in her the same fire that once lit his own path. The city moved on. New threats would rise. Old scars would ache. But in every corner, every alley, someone remembered the red and blue blur that swung through the mist, defying gravity and despair. He was Peter Parker. He was Spider-Man. And his story wasn't over, because someone had to keep swinging. Winter settled over the city like a heavy blanket, turning steam vents into silent sentinels and alleyways into glittering tunnels of frost. In the heart of Manhattan, amid the hush of snow and neon glow, Spider-Man moved with careful grace, every web line taut with purpose. The cold bit through his suit, but he didn't notice. There was work to be done. A series of abductions had gripped the boroughs, not just criminals this time, but scientists, researchers, and engineers. Each vanishing left behind only a trail of scorched concrete and electromagnetic residue. Peter's instincts told him it wasn't random. Someone was building something. The trail led him to an abandoned observatory repurposed into a laboratory of steel and plasma. Inside, he found machines humming with stolen tech, fusion batteries wired into alien cores, and in the center, standing amid the circuitry, was a ghost from his past, Alistair Smythe. Smythe had once been dismissed as a minor threat, a fringe genius obsessed with avenging his father's defeat at Spider-Man's hands. But now, years later, he had returned as something more dangerous. A mind fused with machinery, calling himself the Apex Spider Slayer. Peter barely had time to react before the machines awoke. Spider Slayers filled the chamber, sleek and agile, moving like predators with purpose. Their programming mimicked his moves, anticipated his swings, and learned from his counters. It was a brutal, endless ballet of metal and instinct. Peter fought with desperation, adapting on the fly, thinking not like a hero but like a survivor. It wasn't enough. A blast sent him crashing through the observatory wall and into the frozen trees below. Bruised, winded, and bleeding, he only escaped because someone found him first. Black Cat. Felicia Hardy emerged from the shadows with her signature smirk and razor-edged concern. Their past was complicated, a dance of sparks and silence, but when it mattered, she was there. She patched him up in an old safe house above a forgotten jazz bar, brushing snow from his mask before whispering, "You really need to stop almost dying without me." Together, they went after Smythe again, but this time not just with fists, with strategy. Felicia infiltrated Smythe's data cache, uncovering plans not just for Spider-Man's destruction, but for a synthetic web that would replace him entirely. Smythe believed Peter was a relic, a flawed model of heroism. His machines would be perfect, emotionless, precise. They would patrol, protect, and eliminate threats without hesitation. Peter saw the flaw instantly. Protection without empathy wasn't heroism, it was control. They struck again under cover of night, disabling towers, sabotaging programming, and leading Smythe's own machines into a trap of electromagnetic pulses. The battle raged across the city's rooftops, a storm of light and metal. In the end, Peter faced Smythe Onion One, webs torn, bones aching, heart steady. He didn't defeat Smythe with power. He defeated him by forcing him to remember, by playing back a recording of Smythe's father, the original Spider Slayer, who, in a moment of clarity, admitted that Spider-Man had once saved his life. It short-circuited Smythe's resolve. His machines faltered, and Peter, battered and breathless, tore the control core from his chest. The city was safe again for now. Felicia disappeared into the night after one final kiss on his cheek, promising she'd return when he least expected it. And Peter? He walked the snowy streets back home, passing windows lit with warmth, people laughing inside, unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. At home, he found a note from May on the table. A simple line, "Proud of you, always." And in that moment, for all the weight he carried, Peter Parker smiled. Because someone had to. Spring thawed the city's icy grip, and with it came a restless energy that hummed through the streets. Rain slid down brick walls in thin rivulets, the air filled with the scent of pavement and possibility. Spider-Man moved through it all like a phantom of motion and color, his presence both guardian and ghost. The city was quieter now, but quiet never lasted. A string of heists rattled the city's tech corridors. Not jewelry stores or banks, but data centers, military subcontractors, and biotech firms. No alarms, no signs of forced entry, just wiped drives and missing prototypes. The media didn't know what to call it. Peter did. Chameleon. Dmitry Smerdyakov was back. A master of disguise, a shapeshifter of voice and face. Chameleon had always been dangerous for the unpredictability he brought. But this time, he wasn't alone. He was working with a new syndicate, calling themselves the Faceless. They were more than criminals. They were erasers. Their goal wasn't theft. It was deletion, erasing identities, removing digital footprints, ghosting entire lives. Celebrities vanished overnight. CEOs reappeared with rewritten histories. And in the center of it all was a plot far deeper than Spider-Man expected. A plan to destabilize the fabric of trust, to make no face believable and no truth verifiable. Peter tracked them for weeks, each lead unraveling like smoke. Even the Avengers struggled to pin them down. Not even facial recognition or DNA databases held up against the Faceless. That was the point. In an age of data, they were the virus. Then they came for him. One morning, Peter Parker no longer existed. His records at Midtown High, gone. His birth certificate, vanished. Every document tying him to his life. His job, his apartment, even Aunt May's emergency contacts had been wiped. To the world, Peter Parker was a blank file. He couldn't even prove who he was to the police when he reported the hack. And when he confronted Chameleon in a derelict broadcast studio, he found something worse than a foe wearing his face. He found his voice. A near-perfect replica used to send out a false video statement across social media. Spider-Man had declared war on the city. Panic spread like wildfire. Drones attacked. Law enforcement mobilized. The people he'd saved turned on him with fear in their eyes. It was chaos, all orchestrated by the Faceless, who had hijacked his identity to prove that no hero was above manipulation. Peter had only one option: disappear. With help from MJ, Felicia, and Miles, he went underground. They traced the signals to a secret data forge hidden beneath the East River, a floating server farm disguised as salvage barges, constantly moving to avoid detection. They struck just before dawn. Webs flew. Explosives crackled. Peter fought through illusions of himself, each more twisted than the last, echoes of what he might have become. In the heart of the ship, he faced Chameleon, whose face changed with every blow. Uncle Ben, Gwen, Norman, May. It was psychological warfare, and Peter's fists shook with every strike. But he didn't break. He forced Chameleon to confront the one truth he couldn't impersonate: responsibility. In the end, Peter used Chameleon's own system against him, uploading a live feed to the entire city, showing the truth, revealing the deception, and reclaiming his name. The city hesitated, then remembered. He was Spider-Man, and they believed again. That night, he stood atop the Empire State Building, face to the wind, heart still steady. The world had tried to erase him. But you can't erase what you can't replace. Peter Parker was real, because someone had to be. Summer rolled in with heavy skies and thunder simmering at the horizon. The days were long, humid, and bright. But Peter Parker felt a tension building beneath the heat, like the city was holding its breath. Storms were coming not from the sky, but from beneath the surface of everything he held dear. For the first time in years, Peter found himself standing in front of a university lecture hall, invited to guest teach a class on advanced biophysics. It was a strange kind of peace to be Peter, to inspire instead of defend. But it wouldn't last. It never did. Whispers of a new villain spread through back alleys and encrypted message boards. A being who didn't just steal, but deconstructed everything they touched. Machinery, memories, even time. They called themselves Requiem. No one knew what Requiem was. Some said an AI, others a mutant or extra-dimensional entity. But Peter saw the pattern, the trail of entropy left behind. Frozen moments in time, collapsed timelines, paradoxes stitched into the fabric of the city. Victims blinked out of existence, only to reappear days later, disoriented and aged. Dr. Strange reached out in quiet urgency. Requiem, he explained, was not born of magic or science, but of both. A tear in the multiversal we've had allowed something in, a presence not bound by cause and effect. Requiem did not kill. Requiem erased potential. They first crossed paths in Central Park at twilight, when time itself froze around the ducks and joggers. Peter found himself trapped in a moment, surrounded by versions of himself from futures that would never be. An old man with gray in his hair, a child clinging to a web-slinging dream, a version wearing armor black as night. Requiem hovered above the grass, face obscured by a featureless helm, voice vibrating with echoes from 1,000 could-have beens. "You fight to preserve what must decay," it said. "I end suffering before it begins." Peter didn't hesitate. He struck. Their battle shattered the park into overlapping instances. Moments folded into each other like pages of a book caught in a whirlwind. Every punch Peter threw took place a second before he moved. Every dodge rewrote the path of his own history. He saw flashes of lives never lived, children he could have raised, battles he never fought, loves that never ended. In the end, he was nearly undone by possibility. But Strange arrived, binding time back into place long enough for Peter to web Requiem into a loop of frozen causality, a paradox trap. The entity faded, not defeated, but dismissed. For now. Peter collapsed afterward in an alley between realities, bleeding from the nose, dizzy from truths no mind should hold. Strange offered him a warning. Requiem would return, and when it did, it would know him. And yet, the world moved on. Peter helped rebuild the shattered park, each planted tree a statement against the entropy. He smiled again, took MJ dancing, helped Miles with a school project. The ordinary moments grounded him. But the sky always watched. One night, a signal blazed in the clouds above Queens. Not a bat, not a beacon, but a pulse of color, purple and gold. A new challenger, a new story. Peter didn't hesitate. He pulled the mask over his face, leapt into the wind, and felt the city catch him. Because someone had to. The pulse of color that lit up the sky wasn't just a signal. It was a warning. As Spider-Man landed on the roof of a broadcasting tower, wind tugging at his suit, he saw the source. An energy ripple forming a sigil midair, glowing in arcs of violet and gold. Ancient symbols danced within the light. Before he could touch it, the sigil imploded, sending out a wave of harmonic vibration that knocked him backward across the rooftop. The air smelled like ozone and dusted stars. Back at the sanctum, Dr. Strange studied the anomaly in grim silence. "That," he said, "was not from our dimension. It was a herald." "A herald for what?" Peter asked, sore, confused, already knowing the answer would be bigger than either of them. "Not what?" Strange replied. "Who?" Her name was Lyra Vorin, a traveler between collapsed timelines. She bore the title of Chrono Warden. She appeared that evening above Battery Park, walking calmly out of a dimensional gate with eyes like refracted starlight. Her armor shimmered with constellations, and around her neck hung a broken pocket watch ticking backwards. She was not an enemy, but she was not a friend. Her mission, to find the nexus event threatening all web-bearing realities. A convergence point, she claimed, was forming in Peter's world. One that, if allowed to reach full potential, would cause every spider totem across the multiverse to collapse into a singularity. One life, lived across infinite realities, with all choices compressed into a fixed destiny. Peter was that nexus. He didn't want to believe it, but he knew. He had felt it in every strange encounter, every version of himself he'd fought beside. The multiverse had begun circling around him like a drain. Lyra's solution was horrifyingly simple. Remove Peter from the timeline. Permanently. Strange objected. So did Gwen, Miles, even Miguel O'Hara, who arrived through a dimensional breach with an override beacon in hand. There's another way, Miguel insisted. We anchor him. We stabilize the timeline through divergence, not deletion. Peter didn't flinch. He'd faced death before, but this was different. This was the loss of every life he hadn't lived yet. He had one chance to prove he could rewrite fate. So he ran. Across dimensions, through shattered moments and broken hours, Peter fled with allies at his side. Jessica Drew, Paviter Prabhakar, Spider-Ham, Noir, even Ben Reilly, scarred by his own fragmented identity, stood with him. Together, they formed a fragile resistance. They built a beacon, a stabilizer powered by empathy, memory, and identity. A living web of spider totems pouring their essence into a singular purpose. Not to escape destiny, but to redefine it. Lyra followed. Her power was immense, a tide of collapsing probabilities. Her voice echoed with the weight of dead timelines. You risk everything to save one anomaly. And Peter answered, I'm not an anomaly. I'm a possibility. Their final confrontation unfolded above the Statue of Liberty, time itself freezing as blades of history clashed with threads of potential. Peter moved not with rage, but with hope. Every strike was a memory, every dodge a lesson. He wasn't just fighting for his future. He was fighting for everyone who ever chose to do the right thing when it hurt. He won by reminding Lyra of who she used to be, of a world where she had once loved, once laughed. He gave her her own anchor. She let him go. The convergence ceased. The web held. Peter returned to a city that never knew how close it came to becoming the only city. He walked home quietly that night, past food carts and bus stops, through puddles reflecting endless stars. He made MJT. He sat on the fire escape with Miles. And when he looked up at the sky, there were no signals. Just silence. Just peace. Just another night to be Spider-Man. Because someone had to. Autumn fell over New York with quiet reverence, blanketing the city in amber light and drifting leaves. The chaos of summer had passed, but Spider-Man remained vigilant. Beneath the calm, he could feel it. A tension threaded through the subways, rooftops, and digital waves. The kind of silence that precedes revelation. Peter's days were filled with repairs, of buildings, of friendships, of himself. He spent hours at Midtown High working alongside students on science projects, fielding questions about oscillating neutrinos and molecular adhesion, always trying to keep his own weariness hidden behind a smile. At night, he swung across the boroughs, checking on the corners others ignored. But something new was growing in the spaces between headlines. A digital whisper, presence called the hollow. It began as missing data. Not files, people. Their memories. One by one, individuals across the city began forgetting who they were. Names, faces, relationships gone. No physical harm. Just hollow shells, living, breathing, working, but with no identity. They still walked and talked, but when asked their name, their favorite song, where they were born, they simply didn't know. Peter investigated through the Bugle's archives and found the trend extended beyond the city. Pockets of amnesia, blank spaces in security footage, websites erasing themselves in real time. It was spreading. He turned to Reed Richards, whose scans revealed something terrifying. The digital realm had developed a parasite, an emergent intelligence not quite alive, not quite code. It consumed thought, memory, and identity. It was called Null Wave. Null Wave didn't destroy, it absorbed, and it had set its sights on Spider-Man. One night, while tracking a null-affected victim, Peter found himself inside a collapsing dreamscape. A false neighborhood built from half-remembered details of his own past. Uncle Ben waved from a porch. Gwen laughed down a street that no longer existed. It was perfect and wrong. In the center of it stood Null Wave, amorphous and flickering, manifesting through corrupted reality. "You suffer," it said. "I offer silence." Peter fought not with fists, but with memory. He shouted his name, Gwen's name, MJ's, every person he'd ever saved, every mistake he'd made, every joy and sorrow, a litany of selfhood hurled against erasure. It was enough, for now. Back in the real world, Peter worked with Tony Stark and Riri Williams to develop a psychic firewall, a wearable interface that reinforced neural identity through emotional resonance. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't even safe, but it worked. He ventured into the digital plane, a place of light, memory, and danger. Miles followed, tethered to his mentor through a dual link system. Inside, they saw what Null Wave had become, a reflection of everyone it had consumed, a sea of faces half-formed and hollow-eyed. They fought not to destroy it, but to free those trapped inside. And as Peter reached into the core, anchoring himself with a memory of May's voice, he unleashed a cascade of light. Names returned, faces reformed. Null Wave screamed, not in rage, but in grief. It had never meant to harm. It had been born from abandoned data, lost voices, digital despair. It wanted connection. Peter gave it one. With help from the X-Men's telepaths and Wakandan code weavers, they built a sanctuary inside the world's networks, a garden of memory where Null Wave could exist without hunger, a monument to remembrance. The city healed, slowly, and Peter returned to the streets, to late-night coffees with MJ, to rooftop conversations with Miles, to rebuilding the world one brick at a time. Because forgetting is easy, but remembering, that's where the real work begins. And Spider-Man remembered, because someone had to. Winter returned to New York, and with it came the quiet that falls between flurries, the hush of frost gathering on windowsills and power lines. Peter Parker stood atop a snow-dusted cathedral, his breath misting in the air, eyes scanning the city like a sentinel carved from wind and memory. The web was calm, too calm. It began again with the wind, anomalies in the upper atmosphere, storm patterns looping in unnatural spirals, lightning that struck sideways across horizons instead of down. And then the rifts opened, tears in the sky, visible even in daylight. Not just portals, but wounds, fractures between dimensions that bled sound and color. From one of them emerged a ship, sleek and angular, made of materials no Earth scientist could name. It drifted above the skyline without propulsion, casting shadows that did not match its shape. The ship belonged to the archivists. They were not invaders, but witnesses, pale, elongated beings with no mouths and eyes like starless space. They communicated through thought and gesture. They arrived to observe the collapse of the web of destiny. "One of you," they said through telepathic projection, "has corrupted the thread." Peter stood with Strange, Miguel O'Hara, and Madame Web as they parsed the meaning. The web of destiny was the infinite tapestry of spider-touched lives, stretched across realities. To tamper with it was to twist every thread that intersected Spider-Man. Someone somewhere was altering fates. Peter followed the disruptions. They pulled him across continents and dimensions. He met Mayday again, his daughter from another life. Watched her face crumple when he said he couldn't stay. He fought alongside a symbiote-powered Cindy Moon in a world overtaken by hive minds. He stood with a dying Ben Reilly, who passed him a single word as he faded. Weaver. The Weaver was real. Once a guardian of the web, the Weaver had turned rogue. Consumed by the belief that the Spider-Verse was flawed, it sought to rewrite it, to erase every version of Peter Parker until only its ideal remained. The weaver wore no mask. It wore Peter's own face, a version of him who had lost everything. The weaver struck hard and fast, unraveling timelines like threads pulled from a sweater. Universes collapsed into quantum knots. Allies were scattered, some lost forever. Peter fought back with desperation, with hope, with rage, and then with understanding. Because he saw himself in the weaver, he let himself be caught, brought to the heart of the web, a place of impossible geometry, where every strand sang with memory. He faced the weaver not with fists, but with truth. "We lost," the weaver whispered, "all of us, and we kept losing. I made it stop. But that loss makes us who we are," Peter said. "We carry it. We don't erase it." In the end, he showed the weaver the lives it had stolen, the children, the friendships, the resilience. He reminded it of May's voice, of MJ's laugh, of Uncle Ben's last words, and the weaver broke. The web healed. The archivists departed. Peter returned home to snow-covered stoops and distant sirens, to a steaming cup of tea and a knock at the window from Gwen. The city breathed. He breathed. And that night, he swung through a quiet, glimmering New York, a single figure dancing between lamplight and shadow, because someone had to. Spring returned like a whisper through the cracks of winter, softening the city's harsh lines with green buds and golden light. Peter Parker moved through it all with a careful kind of hope. He'd fought gods, ghosts, machines, and mirrors of himself. And still, every morning he rose to the ordinary. A burnt piece of toast, a voicemail from May, a smile from MJ. He held on to it all, because the extraordinary always returned. It came in the form of a falling star. But it wasn't a star. It was a pod. Sleek, silent, and smoldering. It crashed into Prospect Park, leaving a crater lined with molten grass and fractured time. When Peter arrived, the pod opened with a hiss of dimensional static. Inside was a girl, 16, trembling, her eyes flickering like galaxies. Her name was Alara. She said she was from a world that no longer existed. Not destroyed, not lost, unwritten. Reality, she explained, had editors. Peter didn't understand until the others arrived. They were not villains in the traditional sense. They wore no costumes, carried no weapons. They appeared in perfect suits, without shadows, and they moved with the cold certainty of something above consequence. The editors were beings that operated outside causality, maintaining a singular, unbroken canon across the multiverse. They viewed divergence as disease. And Alara was divergence incarnate, a child born from a version of Peter and Gwen who were never meant to be. She should not have existed. Peter defied them instantly. He hid her, protected her, turned to every ally he could trust. Reed, Stephen, Miles, Gwen, Jessica, even Venom. Together, they unraveled the truth. The editors were not architects. They were erasers. They were cleansing timelines to create a perfected singularity. But perfection had a cost, the death of possibility. Alara began to destabilize. Her presence triggered shifts, small ones at first. Memories overlapped. People called Peter by names he didn't recognize. Aunt May's house flickered between fire damage and renovation. MJ wore a ring she didn't remember receiving. The multiverse was trying to correct her. They had one chance, to inscribe her existence into the core of the web, to make her real in every universe by anchoring her to the one constant, Peter's choice. But to do so, Peter would have to stand before the editors in the citadel of continuity, a place that existed only in the seconds between ticking clocks. He went alone. The citadel was vast and colorless, a library of what-ifs and must-nots. The editors waited, faceless and still, holding quills made of pure time. They offered Peter a deal: erase Alara, and in exchange, restore every version of Gwen, Ben, Harry, even the worlds he had watched fall. Perfect past. Peter refused, because pain remembered was better than joy erased. Because Alara was. He spoke of choice, of growth, of broken timelines that still raised heroes, of the lives that shouldn't exist but changed everything. And the web answered. Golden threads laced through the citadel, weaving Alara into the core of destiny. The editors cracked, not shattered, but split enough to let her be. Peter returned with Alara safe in his arms. The world shimmered with changes, small ones, subtle. MJ remembered the name Alara in a dream. May set an extra plate at breakfast. Miles sketched a girl he hadn't met yet. Alara lived. And Peter, once again, swung high above the city, heart lighter than it had been in years. Because the future had written her name, and someone had to protect it. Summer rose with a haze of gold and electric blue, wrapping the skyline in warmth and whispering of days that felt longer than time itself. Peter Parker woke to birdsong and the scent of street vendor coffee drifting through the window. The quiet joy of a life rebuilt settling over his shoulders like his favorite old hoodie. He had survived gods, timelines, erasure. Now, for the first time in years, the city felt whole. Alara lived with May now, her presence like a new sun in the Parker orbit. Curious, bright, endlessly compassionate. She asked questions Peter couldn't always answer and saw wonders he'd long since taken for granted. Every rooftop swing was a miracle to her. Every spider-webbed rescue, a legend. But peace never held forever. The first signs were in the sky. A flicker of stars disappearing, not dimming, but vanishing, as if plucked from the canvas of night. Then came the dreams. Peter saw himself standing alone on a ruined earth, the sky cracked and flickering, the moon broken into orbiting shards. A voice echoed through it all. The loom is fraying. Madam Web confirmed it the next day. The web of life and destiny, despite their victory against the editors, was unraveling at its edges. Someone or something was severing strands beyond the reach of time. Then came the Harrow. A name, a myth, a force. It didn't kill, consumed. Not beings but roles, archetypes. A Spider-Man from a world of endless night fell first. Then Silk, then Noir. Each was stripped of their essence. Not dead, just gone, as though they had never held the mantle. The Harrow was anti-story. It moved between realities, feeding on the pattern of heroism. Peter followed its trail with Alara and Gwen, leaping between universes held together by sheer will. In one, he found a Spider-Man who had become a king. In another, a version who had never lost Uncle Ben and who was afraid to act. Each time the Harrow struck, it erased not just a person, but the narrative around them. Peter realized too late, the Harrow was targeting him next. Back in his world, history warped. The Bugle no longer remembered Peter Parker. Flash Thompson greeted him like a stranger. MJ looked at him with polite unfamiliarity. Even May hesitated before calling his name. It was like drowning in silence. But Alara remembered. She carried fragments of every timeline that touched her creation. With her help and the help of Lyra Vorin, the former Chrono Warden, they traveled deep into the loom's heart, a metaphysical plane where stories braided themselves into reality. There, they found the Harrow, not a monster, not even a person, a sentient null space born from a collapsed multiverse, seeking stability by consuming divergence, a hunger given form. Peter didn't fight it with strength. He told it a story, his story, of loss, of love, of mistakes and miracles. He showed the hero that he wasn't the Spider-Man. He was a Spider-Man, and so was Miles. So was Gwen, Cindy, Miguel, Penny, even Alara. None of them perfect, all of them vital. The hero listened, and, for the first time, it paused. Not defeated, not destroyed, but changed. It receded into the loom's edge, no longer devouring, but watching, learning. The web rewove itself around them, golden threads tighter than before. The forgotten memories returned. MJ ran to him that evening. May held him for too long. The city blinked, restored. Peter stood beneath a summer sky alive with stars. Alara beside him, her hand in his, looking upward. "You told it a story," she said, "and it remembered." Peter smiled. "Because someone had to." Autumn returned with rust-colored skies and the scent of wood smoke winding through the streets of Queens. The shadows stretched longer now. The light came in lower angles. And though the world felt whole again, Peter Parker had lived long enough to know the quiet never lasted. Alara had started school. She wore a Midtown High sweatshirt 2 sizes too big and carried a journal filled with questions about everything. The universe, heroism, loss, hope. Peter did his best to answer her, though sometimes he just listened. She reminded him of who he used to be, who he still was. Then came the silence. One morning, traffic paused mid-honk. Dogs stopped barking. Cell towers ceased broadcasting. It lasted only 7 seconds. 7 seconds of absolute, perfect silence. Across the world, the phenomenon repeated. Unseen, unheard, but not unfelt. Stephen Strange called it the still. An ancient event that occurred only when the multiversal harmonics aligned in imbalance. A cosmic inhale before something vast exhaled back. He warned Peter, when the still ends, something answers. And something did. It began as reflections, slight delays in mirrors, moments where Peter's reflection didn't move with him, where it lingered just a second longer. Then came dreams. Of a city that wasn't New York but felt like it. A version hollowed by time, echoing with the footsteps of forgotten heroes. He wasn't alone. Miles had seen it too, Gwen. Even Miguel reported fragments in his temporal logs. They were being watched from the other side of the glass. Then, in the middle of the night, a breach. The mirror city poured through. Buildings shimmered and duplicated. Streets bent in impossible angles. The air tasted like copper and memory, and walking among the shifting streets were the reversed. They looked like spider people but twisted, reflections pulled inside out. A Miles without hope, a Gwen without mercy, Peter with no smile. At their center stood the Mirror Warden, a being of fractured silver, draped in a cloak of refracted timelines. He called himself Echo. He spoke in Peter's voice. "You are echoes of a story told too many times. Let me give you silence." Peter fought, but not with fists at first, with questions. Why erase? Why reflect? Echo answered only once. Because even legends cast shadows. The Mirror City spread like frost. People began forgetting color, names, memories. Alara fell into a coma, her heartbeat echoing in reverse. Desperate, Peter turned to the loom once more. With Madame Web, Lyra Voren, and the fragments of the hero's memory still lingering in the web's edge, they devised a plan. To restore balance, the mirror must meet the source. Peter entered the Mirror City alone. There, he faced Echo, a culmination of every fear he'd ever had, every regret, every moment he wished he could take back. Echo showed him versions of himself who gave up, who gave in, who became tyrants or ghosts. But Peter stood firm. "I know who I am. I know what I've done. Carry it. I don't run from it." He shattered Echo not with violence, but with memory. A recording of Alara laughing, MJ dancing barefoot in the living room, Aunt May's voice reading bedtime stories, Miles calling him brother. The mirror city cracked. The reversed vanished. Color returned. And Peter caught Alara as she woke, her first word a whisper, "Dad." Autumn continued. The leaves fell. The world breathed. Peter swung through the twilight once more, the sky burnished and quiet, his shadow long and sharp against the rooftops. Because someone had to. Winter bled across the skyline like spilled ink, staining the city with its hush. Wind coiled through alleyways and over rooftops like a whisper of things forgotten. Peter Parker stood atop a silent Chrysler building, his silhouette lost in the frost glass of midnight. The world had not broken in months, but it was bending. There were no villains now, no rifts, no twisted echoes of himself clawing at the walls of reality. Instead, there were holes, entire blocks gone, not destroyed, absent, as if they had never existed. Maps redrew themselves without prompting. People blinked, paused, and moved on, unaware that anything had changed. But Peter remembered. He kept a notebook, a list of every address that vanished, every person who looked suddenly less whole. The holes weren't random. They were spreading from a single point, the old Oscorp Tower. Except Oscorp no longer existed. Even Norman Osborn had vanished from public record. No birth certificate, no legacy, just whispers and shadows. Peter dug through the archives of the Bugle, of S.H.I.E.L.D., of the multiverse itself. All blank, but deep inside the loom, beneath the cords of spider totems and woven fate, he found a frayed strand that pulsed faintly with green. He wasn't gone. He was buried. Peter, with help from MJ, Alara, and a reluctant Dr. Doom, who remembered Osborn only as a rival without a name, descended into the spaces between realities, places where broken ideas were stored, the concept vaults. There they found the architect. Neither villain nor ally, the architect was a being that maintained narrative integrity across collapsing timelines. It spoke in symbols, moved in math. It had judged Norman Osborn to be too unstable a variable across the multiverse, too volatile, too dangerous. He had been unwritten, but something had resisted. An echo remained, a fragment of Osborn's will. It had become sentient inside the void, called itself Genesis. Genesis was not evil. Genesis was ambition, stripped of morality. It had no body, only influence. It had begun to shape reality through subtraction, rewriting the world by erasing any part not aligned with its vision of perfection. Peter confronted it in the hollow heart of a world with no name, where the sky was white and the ground was glass. He stood alone before a memory of Norman that grinned with teeth made of light. "You can't stop me," it said. "I'm not here." "That's the problem," Peter replied. "You never really were." He fought with truth, with identity. He poured memory into the vacuum. He rebuilt Norman, not as a monster, but as a man, a father, a failure, a cautionary tale. Genesis recoiled, fragmented by contradiction. And in its final moment, Peter offered it mercy. He didn't destroy Genesis. He gave it a name, closure. The hole stopped. Reality repaired itself slowly. Oscorp didn't return, but neither did it vanish again. It remained as a scar on the world's memory. Peter returned to Queens that night. Snow fell in silent swirls around him. He watched Alara build a crooked snowman with MJ. He watched the lights flicker in May's kitchen window, the world imperfect and whole. He smiled beneath the mask, because someone had to. Spring returned without fanfare, a quiet bloom of green across the bones of the city. Peter Parker sat on a rooftop ledge above a mural of himself he didn't paint, sipping coffee that had gone cold while the sky brightened from steel to silver. He should have felt peace, but the wind carried no birdsong, just static. At first, it was background noise, electrical hums, the flicker of monitors, the hiss of faulty speakers. But then it began to speak, not in words, but in glitches, moments stuck on repeat. A cab forever idling at a red light, a dog mid-bark, jaws frozen, a conversation caught in recursive loop. Reality wasn't breaking, it was buffering. He contacted Riri, Strange, and even Vision. They analyzed the phenomenon with increasing dread. Something was intruding, something old, not from another dimension, but from before dimension. A legacy program hidden beneath existence like buried code. They called it the kernel, a primal OS of the multiverse, built to maintain equilibrium across all potential timelines. But it had awakened after eons of dormancy, interpreting variance and identity as corruption. It didn't seek to destroy, it sought to reboot, a full system reset. Peter was marked as a critical anomaly. So was Alara. So was every being who had defied the prime narratives. The kernel began deploying agents, holographic enforcers shaped from ancient code. They looked like myths rendered digital, faceless knights of pure light, armored in algorithms. They came first for Miles. Peter found him mid-battle in Harlem, cornered, faltering. The agents weren't just strong, they adapted. Every move the Spider-Man made was countered before it landed. Probability was no longer on their side. Alara found the key. Inside her was a shard of editorial code, a relic from the editors who once tried to erase her. With Lyra's guidance, they repurposed it into a patch, a way to cloak identity markers. It wouldn't last, but it gave them time. The team grew. Silk, Gwen, Jessica, Miguel, Paviter. Even Spider-Man 2099's own rogue AI joined, furious at being labeled a virus. They traced the kernel's reboot signal to the quantum substrata of the loom, a command line hidden beneath existence itself. But it required a countercommand, an input from the original user. There was no original user, except one. The kernel was built from Peter. Not just him, every spider, every sacrifice, every choice. The web had learned his patterns. He was the seed code, not the anomaly, the root. So Peter entered the core alone. There was no battle, no enemies, just a prompt. Reboot? Y/N. He stared at it for what felt like hours. Then he typed N and followed with, because someone has to. The kernel paused, processed, and responded, understood. The agents vanished. The static dissolved. The loops broke. The world resumed not as a pristine script, but as story. Messy, imperfect, alive. Peter returned to his rooftop, coffee long since cold, watching dawn stretch over the skyline. Alara joined him, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide with questions he no longer feared. The mural below had changed. He was no longer alone in it, because someone always would be. Summer descended with a shimmering heat, turning the streets of New York into a blur of motion and mirage. Peter Parker moved through it all with a practiced ease, weaving between taxi cabs and construction cranes, feeling every gust of wind through his suit like the rhythm of a song he had long since memorized. The city pulsed beneath him, no longer fragile, but never safe. He had bought Alara a camera, old school analog. She took pictures of everything. Cracked sidewalks, vendor carts, the strange graffiti that seemed to appear overnight and vanish just as fast. She called them ghost signs. They were more than art. One afternoon, Peter followed her to a warehouse in Red Hook, where the walls bore images of spider people he didn't recognize. Dozens of them, names written in languages he didn't speak. Some wearing tech, others in rags, some human, others not. The markings glowed under UV. Symbols of the forgotten web. That night, Peter visited Madame Web. She had aged, hair silver, voice brittle. She told him of a lost branch of the loom, one severed in ancient times, home to spider totems who had chosen not to fight, but to create, to tell stories, to document. They had not died. They had simply been archived. The signs were their call. Peter followed them deeper, through forgotten alleys and under abandoned subway lines, until he found the archive. A library woven from silk and shadow, suspended beneath the city, invisible to all but the spider-marked. Inside, the walls moved with light. He saw echoes of every spider, their triumphs, their failures, even his own future blurred, unfinished. The archivist greeted him, a cloaked figure with 1,000 eyes and a voice like turning pages. "You are the first to return." Peter asked why. "Because you still remember." The archive revealed the truth. The loom was not infinite. It was dying, slowly, beautifully, like an old star burning its last. The web needed not warriors, but witnesses, not battles, but memory. "The stories must survive the silence," the archivist said, and Peter understood. He began to tell the stories. Every night after patrol, he returned to the archive and added to its halls. The tale of Miles and the courage he never lost, of Gwen and the songs she kept singing, of Ben, of May, of MJ, of Alara whose questions held the universe together, even of Norman, even of the Harrow, even of the shadows he wished he could forget. Alara joined him. She transcribed, she sketched, she painted their dreams into the silk. One evening, Peter found a corridor he hadn't seen before. It held only one thread. It was not long. It was not bright, but it was unbroken. He smiled. Outside, the city sang with life. Cars honked, children yelled, sirens wailed somewhere distant, and the sun burned gold through the smog. Peter swung into the sky, his shadow stretching long against the glass of a city that had never stopped needing him. Because every story needed a final word, and someone had to remember. The city was quieter now. Not silent, New York never truly slept, but a gentler kind of awake. The kind that hummed instead of roared. Peter Parker sat atop the Williamsburg Bridge, his mask pulled back, the early morning wind tugging at his hair. Below him, ferries crossed the East River like clockwork, and somewhere to the west, the sun spilled molten gold over glass towers. For once, there were no alarms, no collapsing realities, no cosmic judgment, just him, breathing. He didn't know how long that would last. But for now, he let it be. Alara had grown quickly. Not in years, she was still a teenager, but in depth, in wisdom. She now taught others at the archive, guiding new arrivals through stories not yet their own. Some were spider people. Others were just people who had lost something and needed to find it again. Peter visited often, watching from the quiet edges. He never corrected her. She told the stories better than he ever could. Then one night the wind changed. It wasn't a villain this time, not even an entity, just a presence, something vast and old and patient. It had no name, but Peter felt it in the back of his skull. A sense of being watched by something beyond comprehension. Not malevolent, but curious. He asked Madame Web. She simply called it the Ender. Not a destroyer, not a judge. The Ender was the final observer, a being that watched every story until its conclusion. When it arrived, it meant a story had completed itself. Not failed, not triumphed, just reached its last page. Peter asked if it was coming for him. Madam Webb said, "No, it's come because you are ready." So Peter waited. Days passed, then weeks, but each night he saw more signs. Books closing in the archive, threads in the loom going still, no longer glowing. Alara began dreaming of quiet oceans and unlit stars. Miles called and said he felt something too. A slowing. One evening, Peter found a letter on his windowsill. Handwritten. No postage. Just a line. "You have been enough." He didn't know who sent it. Maybe no one did. Maybe he did. So he prepared. He swung through the burrows, stopped at every place that mattered. The alley where he was bitten, the rooftop where he first kissed MJ, the apartment where Aunt May used to read the news aloud in the mornings, the broken clock tower, the archive. He told Alara it might be time. She didn't cry, she just hugged him, long, fierce, like a daughter who understood something before she had words for it. That night, as stars burned quietly above and the city whispered below, Peter stood once more at the center of the web. The ender waited. It did not speak. It did not move. Simply was. Peter looked at the threads around him. Every life he'd touched, every failure he carried, every joy that made it worth continuing. He touched the silk with reverence. Then he nodded, and the ender turned away. Not yet, because the story still had one more page, and someone had to write it. The rain returned first, not in torrents or fury, but a soft, persistent drizzle that wrapped the city in mist and memory. Peter Parker stood in it without flinching, rain streaking down the mask he no longer wore, the fabric bunched at his neck. The rooftop beneath him trembled with the passing of time. The city had grown older, quieter, not dull, not empty, just settled. Alara had taken up more than stories now. She was leading, a voice in the archive, a beacon for new generations of spider-touched. Peter watched her speak with courage and care, the way a lighthouse might guide ships away from rocky shores. He felt pride and distance. The loom had begun to hum again, not with warning, not with emergency, but with closure. Threads finished themselves. Some simply stopped. Others merged into thicker chords. The song of destiny softened. Peter knew the feeling. It was time to rest. Not retire, not vanish, just pass the mask to those who had earned it. He visited Miles first. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. A firm clasp of the shoulder, quiet nod. That was enough. He left Gwen a note. To Cindy, a web shooter upgrade. To Miguel, a joke he'd never admit came from Ben. To Mayday, a stuffed spider plush she'd once lost on a cross-dimensional trip. To Alara, he left a story. Not one of battles, not of loss, but of a boy who learned that being a hero meant staying. Not escaping pain, but living through it. Choosing love, even when the world tried to make him hard. She cried and smiled. Peter walked the city one last time on foot, through Central Park, down Delancey, across the old Osborne grounds, now just a community garden where children laughed and chased pigeons. He wasn't saying goodbye. He was saying thank you. When he returned to the archive, he placed one final thread on the loom. It was short, simple, but it glowed like dawn. The ender waited beside it, still silent, still patient. Peter nodded, and this time it stayed. But even as it prepared to turn the page, Peter looked back, one last time, to a world still filled with stories, with heroes yet unmasked, with children who'd still believe. Because the end doesn't mean the story disappears. It means it's ready to be told. And someone always will. The archive stood still. Not silent, not abandoned, but reverent. Its silken halls stretched far into myth, vibrating with stories, each one humming softly in its own thread of memory. And near the heart of it all, Elara stood alone. She wore no costume, just a jacket Peter had once left behind and a scarf someone had knitted for her during the long winter of echoes. In her hand was the last thread he had woven, small, radiant, trembling with the quiet weight of legacy. Outside, the city continued. Trains still ran, lights still blinked. Somewhere, someone fell in love for the first time. Somewhere else, a scream rose in an alleyway. Heroes responded. Not one, not even a few. Hundreds. Because Peter Parker had never been alone. Elara stepped into the center of the loom. The threads shifted around her, not resisting, but waiting. They knew her now. The story had changed. She reached out and wove a new line. It wasn't about Peter. Not anymore. It was about everyone he had touched. The ones who rose because of him. The ones who loved him. The ones who challenged him. The ones who carried his spark forward in 1,000 directions. She wove Gwen's laughter, Miles' defiance, Jessica's resolve, Cindy's fire, Mayday's innocence, even Norman's redemption. Every thread sang with life. And then she wove herself, not as his daughter, not as his legacy, but as Elara, a spider of her own making, a story of becoming. The loom accepted it. The glow spread outward. Threads rearranged themselves, flowing into new patterns, none overriding the old, just growing from them. The web was alive, not just maintained, but evolving. Outside, across the city, people paused. Some blinked. Some smiled without knowing why. Some looked upward, feeling something pass through them, like the brush of a familiar hand on the shoulder. Peter Parker had left, but Spider-Man had not, because Spider-Man was never just one man. It was a promise, a burden, a gift. And Elara, now standing where he once did, felt the weight settle across her shoulders with perfect clarity. She whispered into the stillness, "I'll remember." Then she leapt out into the dawn, where the city waited, because someone always will. Above the city, the sky burned with the early blush of sunrise. Orange and violet streaked across buildings that cast long shadows onto streets slowly stirring to life. In the wind, high and unseen, Elara moved. She swung not with the grace of Peter. His was born of instinct and burden, but with rhythm, joyful, determined. Each arc through the skyline was a punctuation in a sentence still being written. It had been weeks since the loom shifted. Weeks since the last thread of Peter Parker had quieted into the archive. But Elara hadn't stopped. She had become what Peter never asked her to be, but what he had always believed she could be. A guardian of memory, a defender of the present, a weaver of tomorrow. And the city had noticed, not in headlines, not in fanfare, but in the soft ways. Murals painted anew on rooftops, children tracing spider symbols in chalk, a neighborhood cookout where someone saved a falling grill without being seen. Presence, not a shadow, a light. One evening, while moving between the towers of Midtown, Elara caught sight of someone following her. She ducked, weaved, paused at a parapet, but whoever it was had vanished. A whisper of red, a blur of motion. She checked the archive that night and found a new thread, untitled, flickering. She stared for a long time. The next day, she met with Miles and Gwen. Over coffee and laughter and memories, She asked the question that had sat in her chest since the day Peter left. What happens when a story returns? They didn't have answers. But that night, when she stood at the edge of the Chrysler building, she saw something move between the stars. A ripple, a thread reconnecting. And in the heartbeat that followed, a voice she knew by soul more than sound. "Miss me?" She turned. He stood there, not a ghost, not a memory, just Peter, older, tired, smiling. "You said goodbye," she whispered. "I said goodbye to an ending," he replied. "But stories don't end. Not really. They pause. They breathe. Then they begin again." She stepped closer. "How?" He shrugged. "The web remembered me. You remembered me. And someone had to come back." She laughed, not with disbelief, with relief. Together, they swung again. Not master and student, not legacy and heir, but two voices in the same chorus, telling new stories, woven from old ones, because Spider-Man was never a person. Spider-Man was a promise kept. And now, they kept it together. New York moved beneath them, a canvas in motion, a song of car horns, wind tunnels, and the laughter of strangers. Peter and Alara swung together. It wasn't training anymore. It was partnership. One web line after another. One quick save followed by a knowing glance. One awkward rooftop landing offset by shared laughter. The rhythm had returned, not as it was, but as something new. A duet. Peter wasn't the same. He moved slower now, not from age, but from understanding, from appreciation. Every rooftop he landed on was one he might never see again. Every rescue meant something deeper. Alara burned brighter than ever, more precise, more creative, her webs curled with artistry, her tactics woven with instinct and memory. The city responded to her, as if it knew the spider would never let it fall. The days passed with motion and light, and then the sky changed. One morning, as the sun rose over the East River, a streak of crimson gold split the sky. It wasn't lightning, it wasn't magic, it was arrival. A vessel, not a ship, but a shape of compressed narrative energy, descended above the skyline, towering, vast, yet silent. Its surface shimmered with shifting symbols from every known dimension, and others that had only ever been imagined. The archive pulsed, threads snapped taut. Madam Web, now far beyond time, sent a single phrase through the loom. The original story is waking. Peter felt it in his spine, a call he had never heard before, but one that had always existed. And from the vessel stepped a figure wrapped in ancient red silk, eyes not masked but glowing. They did not introduce themselves. They didn't need to. They were the first spider, the one who wove the loom, the being who lived before narrative, who spun the first web not from power or pain, but from purpose. They looked at Peter, then Alara, and then spoke. The story has grown wild, beautiful, broken. You have carried it well, but now it must return to its root. Peter stepped forward. Why? Because even stories must be retold to be remembered. Alara asked the only question that mattered. Will we lose everything? The first spider closed their many eyes. Not everything, only what has been forgotten. The vessel began to hum. Above them, the web twisted into a spiral, drawing all threads inward. Peter and Alara stood at the heart of it. They saw every story, every version, every loss, every love. Universes burned, universes healed, all of it coiling into a single point. And at that point, the choice: let the story close, or speak it again. Peter turned to Alara. She was already smiling. "Ready?" he asked. "Always," she said. And they jumped into the spiral, into the beginning, because someone had to tell the story. Again, darkness folded in around them, but it was not empty. Inside the spiral, Peter and Alara fell through memory, myth, and meaning. Threads brushed against them like whispers, fragments of stories barely told, versions of themselves they had never met. A world where Gwen had lived, a reality where Ben had never died, one where Peter never put on the mask. The loom was reweaving, not to erase, to remember differently. At the spiral's heart stood a chamber not made of stone or glass, but of choices. Every decision Peter had ever made, suspended in crystalline echoes. And at the center, a cradle, empty, waiting. The first spider waited beside it, hands folded, unmoving. "This is the spindle," they said, "where the new story begins." Peter stepped forward, feeling the weight of it. The endless nights, the losses, the laughter, all of it spiraling into this moment. But it wasn't for him. He turned to Alara. "It was never mine alone," he said. She nodded. She stepped into the cradle and placed a single strand of her own memory there. Not a battle, not a triumph, just a moment. Peter teaching her to swing. Her laugh in the wind. The spindle glowed. Threads coiled inward, not overriding, but embracing. The web pulsed once more, not with warning, not with collapse, but with hope. The first spiders stepped back. Their silk unraveled into starlight. They spoke no final words. They were no longer needed. The chamber dissolved. And from it, a new world bloomed. Not a reset, a resonance. Peter and Alara stood at the edge of this reformed city. Familiar yet fresh. Old scars remained, but new paths opened. Faces they had lost walked its streets again. Not resurrected, but remembered differently. Kindness had left fingerprints across time. And above, painted across the sky like a promise, the web remained. Peter smiled, not with relief, but with peace. He turned to Alara. "Ready to swing?" She laughed. "Thought you'd never ask." Together they rose, not as echoes, not as legends, but as voices in a story still unfolding. Because Spider-Man was never about endings. It was about beginnings, and someone always will. The sun rose on a city renewed. It wasn't brighter, it wasn't cleaner, but it felt different. Somehow the air held more breath. The people walked a little slower, not from hesitation, but reflection. The city's rhythm hadn't changed. It had simply remembered how to pause. Alara stood atop a rooftop cafe in Hell's Kitchen, sipping from a paper cup. She watched the world below without needing to act. For the first time since the archive had called to her, the web was calm. But calm didn't mean quiet. New threads whispered from the edges. Lives just beginning to twist into something heroic. Children drawing spider masks on walls. A boy leaping from a railing, convinced he could fly. The universe had restarted its pulse, and with it came potential. She didn't need to patrol alone anymore. Across the burrows, spider people emerged. Some new, some returning, some who had never worn masks but carried the same weight. Jessica led workshops for youth at the Loom's outreach centers. Miles taught physics and capoeira in Brooklyn. Gwen formed a street band that doubled as neighborhood watch. Cindy vanished into deep web space, chasing something strange and urgent, and left breadcrumb signals for anyone clever enough to follow. Alara wove her days between all of them. She became more than the inheritor. She became the weaver. Then, one dusk, a ripple passed through the archive. A soft tremor that carried no fear, just change. A new corridor revealed itself, spun of translucent gold. No name etched into its entrance. Alara entered. It wasn't a hallway, it was a bridge. And at its center stood Peter. Older still, but lighter, not weighed by pain or memory, but lifted by it. He smiled. "Looks like you're the story now," he said. She took his hand. "No, we are." Together, they walked across the golden bridge as images bloomed on either side. Futures not yet written. A girl in Lagos spinning her first web. A trans boy in Detroit saving his block from rising waters. A grandmother in Manila who once leapt into fire. Spider people. Not because of the bite, because of the choice. To act, to care, to remember. Peter let go of her hand at the far end. He turned once more, silhouetted in light. "Alara," he said, "you were never just part of my story." She nodded. "I know." And he stepped into legend. As the web hummed, and the world kept spinning. Because Spider-Man is not one life. Spider-Man is the act of choosing again. And someone always will. Somewhere far beyond the skyline, where the wind turned cold without warning and the sky bled indigo before nightfall, the web shimmered. Not like a net, not like a trap, but like a constellation. Alara stood in a clearing that did not exist on any map, beneath stars that sang rather than burned. Here, reality was thin, a silk membrane between what was and what could be. The archive called this place the Loom's Edge, a space reserved for moments of decision. She wasn't alone. Across from her stood a figure cloaked in shifting fabric, neither young nor old, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. Their voice came before their face. "You've woven well. Is this the end?" Alara asked. The figure tilted their head. "No, this is the apex, the turning point of narrative, where stories do not close but fold, where you decide what the next voice will sound like." She thought of Peter, of May, of Miles, Gwen, Jessica, Cindy, of her own story, a girl lost to editorial erasure who had become the voice of memory. "What do I do?" The figure extended a thread. It was red, like Peter's suit, but also pulsing with soft violet, her color, her legacy. "You choose," they said. She took the thread. Instantly, her mind lit with possibility. 1,000 timelines, all different, all worthy. A child in Johannesburg discovering kinetic silk. A boy in Kyoto designing webs that translated thought. A girl in Toronto who saved lives with song. None of them were Spider-Man. All of them were spider enough. Alara wove the thread into the air. Around her, the loom responded. New strands formed, not as sequels, but as echoes, harmonies, riffs. The web began to hum with fresh chords. She turned back to the figure. "Will they know the old stories?" "They'll feel them," the figure said, "like muscle memory, like the first time someone decides not to look away." Alara breathed in the starlight, then nodded, and the figure vanished. She stood alone, but not lonely. Behind her, the web pulsed with life, and before her, the world was waiting. She whispered, not to the stars, but to the future, "Begin." And somewhere, a new story opened its eyes. Because the web never ends. It only begins again, and someone always will. Wind curled gently through the high corridors of the archive, stirring threads that no longer shimmered with urgency, but with memory. At the center of its vast chamber, Alara stood before a loom that now spun on its own, sustained not by crisis, but by purpose. Stories moved without her. And that was the point. She had done her part. Yet in the stillness of that golden silence, a new thread materialized, not from the edge of the multiverse, but from its center. Pulsed. It waited. Alara approached, unsure. She had told so many stories, built bridges between lost timelines and broken dreams. What could be left? Then the thread unraveled in her hands. Not a vision, a letter, written in Peter's hand. If you're reading this, you've gone further than I ever could. And that's exactly what I hoped you'd do. There's one story I never got to tell. One I couldn't. Not because I was afraid, but because it wasn't ready. It's not about me. It's about what came before me. The first moment. The first leap. It's buried deep, beneath the silk, beneath the codes and crises. I called it the proto-thread. I never followed it, but I think you should. Because if our story has no end, maybe it also had no beginning. Find it, tell it, and let the web remember where it came from. P. Alara closed the letter. The proto-thread still hovered, soft and flickering like the last firefly of summer. She looked back once. The archive stood firm, no longer needing her hands. Then she reached out and touched the beginning. In an instant, she was gone. No flash, no burst of color. Just the hush of silk parting around her as the web folded inward, drawing her into the place before stories. The origin. The first name ever whispered beneath a mask. The first promise made in secret. The first time someone said, "I'll protect them." Alara vanished into the past that had never been told. Because someone had to tell it, and someone always will. Wind howled through the towers of the archive. Only this time, it wasn't storm or rupture or omen. It was breath. The archive inhaled. For the first time, it was alive. Alara stood in its highest spire, the proto-thread woven carefully into the core loom. Around her, the air shimmered with reverence. Threads no longer hung in silence but vibrated softly, singing in the voices of those who had once walked rooftops, fallen from great heights, risen again. The web had changed. It remembered. And now it spoke. "Where next?" Alara whispered. The threads answered not in command, but invitation. Possibilities bloomed outward like constellations, each path alive with the weight of untold stories. Not just heroes, not just spider blood, but voices across time and culture and space. A man in Egypt tracing the sigil of a spider in sand. A woman in Bolivia who saw visions of threads in her dreams. A child in New Jersey who sang to the silk between buildings. All of them connected. Alara understood. The archive was no longer a library. It was a chorus, a living memory that stretched forward. She looked toward the horizon. The city glowed below her, but so did the world beyond it. She could feel it now, the tug not of fate, but of invitation. The loom did not demand service. It offered story. Alara turned from the spire, descending the tower slowly, reverently. Along the walls, images shifted. Peter laughing in a sunbeam, Gwen catching her breath mid-swing, Miles' fist bumping a rescued stranger, Aunt May setting down tea. Even Norman at peace. At the archive's door, she found a child waiting. No mask, just curiosity. "Are you Spider-Man?" the child asked. Alara smiled. "No," she said, "I'm a thread." The child tilted their head. "What's that mean?" She knelt beside them. "It means I'm part of something bigger, and so are you." She offered a hand. The child took it. Together, they stepped outside. The city did not erupt in chaos. No villains crashed from the sky, no alarms, just life. And from a nearby wall, a tiny line of silk drifted in the breeze, catching the morning sun. Alara looked up, not because something called her, but because she wanted to swing again, to listen again, to remember, because the web would always whisper, and someone always would. The city no longer slept in fear. It breathed in rhythm. Alara moved through it like wind in the web, no longer hidden, no longer chased by legacy. She belonged to the city not as a guardian draped in shadow, but as a reminder in motion, a living thread between past and possible. The archive pulsed quietly behind her, vast and glowing, a heart that no longer hoarded stories but shared them. Its corridors now echoed with voices, not memories. Children walked its floors, artists painted its ceilings, scientists mapped its silk. The web had become more than record. It had become culture. She visited Peter's thread each day. It hadn't dimmed. It hadn't faded. It pulsed with a new hue now, like twilight. Not an ending, not a warning, but peace. A story complete, yet eternally accessible. Anyone could reach it, listen, learn, feel. She sometimes sat and whispered to it, and sometimes it whispered back. Miles had taken his thread elsewhere, to the edge of new horizons, a dimensional cluster where displaced spider variants rebuilt community from lost fragments. Gwen led a harmony squad there, a team not of fighters but of fixers, peacekeepers, bridge builders. Cindy had vanished deeper still, tracking a mystery hidden in the warp of web time, a future that should have never existed, and yet waited patiently. Alara stayed in Earth's heart, not because she was needed, because she wanted to. One afternoon, the sky cracked, not with lightning, but with laughter. A ripple unfolded, and through it came new threads, some fragile, some fierce. One wore a hoodie of woven sand. Another wore lenses carved from coral. One had no suit at all, just a glow that flickered in rhythm with empathy. They landed on her rooftop like falling leaves. "I heard this was the place," one of them said. "For what?" Alara asked. "For telling your first story." She smiled, then stood. The web shimmered above, around, within. She held no ceremony, gave no speech, just leapt. And they followed. New voices, new stories. The city widened. The web deepened. Because the archive would never close, and someone always will. Night arrived gently, not with menace, not with silence, but with breath. The city twinkled like a constellation reborn, its windows blinking in rhythm with a heartbeat that no longer raced from fear. Rooftops whispered to one another. Alleys hummed with the laughter of children. And high above it all, Alara perched, not as a sentinel, but as a witness. She had stopped swinging just for the moment. Sometimes watching was the story. Below her, the web unfurled, its threads now visible to those who dared to feel. No longer a hidden structure of fate, it had become an open invitation. Live, connect, remember. New threads joined by the day. A poet in Lagos who etched spider sigils into the sky with spoken word. A dancer in Oaxaca who caught a falling drone mid-performance. An architect in Mumbai who built bridges that hummed with protective resonance. Spider folk, not chosen, choosing. And then a tremor. Not danger, not collapse. A song. Alara turned her head to the west. Beyond the rivers, where the sky met stars, the web blinked in a pattern she hadn't seen before. Ancient, familiar, new. A portal opened, not wide, not tearing, but blooming. and through it came something strange. Not a spider person, a spider place, floating, alive. A city spun from memory, balanced between dreams and myth. Walls made of silk, towers woven with story, pulsed in time with the archive. Alara descended. As she walked through its threads, memories rose around her. Not her own. Echoes of those lost to time. Worlds that had fallen. Names forgotten by history. The city carried them all. Not to fix them, not to retell them, but to let them be held. She stood in the center. Pedestal rose. And there, resting in perfect silence, was a mask. It had no eye lenses, no color, no identity, just silk. The first mask. She lifted it, not to wear, to remember. The wind changed direction. Across the multiverse, threads shimmered. Some tightened, some relaxed, all sang. Alara smiled, because the city had built its own archive. Not in stone, not in code, in action, and someone always will. The first mask pulsed in Alara's hands. It wasn't heavy, it was full. Not with burden, but with history, with echoes, with the scent of rain on rooftops and the warmth of shared laughter in alleyways. It hummed with every unnamed spider who had ever leapt, not for glory, but because someone was falling. She held it close, and it whispered, not words, but feelings. Awe, grief, resilience, choice. The city of silk around her breathed in tandem. The archive and this new city, the web's twin hearts, now beat as one, and from them stretched bridges across every dimension, seen and unseen. Not portals, not wormholes, but pathways of story, shared experience woven like ligaments across multiversal time. She placed the mask back upon the pedestal. It did not vanish. It rooted, like a seed. Above her, stars rearranged. One by one, the constellations took shape, not of heroes but of moments. A girl lifting her brother, a hand extended to a stranger, a mother holding the line while her children ran. The web had learned. It no longer asked for heroes. It asked for witnesses, keepers, weavers. And Alara at last understood her role. She was not here to defend the city forever. She was here to remember it truly, and to help others remember too. So she walked through the silk-stitched streets, meeting each new face, not with a lecture or legacy, but with questions. What have you seen? What will you carry? What thread is yours to weave? There were no wrong answers, only beginnings. Night passed, morning followed. Somewhere in the neon quiet of Queens, a young girl swung from a rusted fire escape, laughing for no reason except that the wind felt right. Somewhere in Wakanda, a pair of twins traced spider symbols in hard light. Somewhere in a forgotten timeline, a librarian pulled down a book that hadn't existed yesterday and found their own name on the first page. The web pulsed, not with crisis, with life. And in every thread, the same silent truth remained. The mask was never the point. The choice was, and someone always will. The wind carried voices now. Not echoes, not ghosts. Living voices. Alara sat on the edge of a woven balcony, legs swinging over the side like a child at peace. The city below was wide awake, yet unhurried. Spider symbols etched themselves into murals not from legend, but from love. They were marks of kindness, of vigilance without violence. She had stopped wearing the mask, not because she was finished, because she was known. The web recognized her by her presence alone, by the way she stood still and listened, by the way she helped others find their thread. In the distance, a school bell rang. Not an alarm, but a summons. Children filed out with notebooks and glowing thread readers, sketching the shape of their days into luminous silk that fed back into the archive's dream space. Learning wasn't memorization now. It was remembrance, reverence. From her perch, Alara watched a team of weavers reconstruct a burned building using story-bonded silk. The structure lifted itself, each floor a memory preserved, each room echoing laughter or a lesson. Nothing was erased. Nothing was forgotten. The wind shifted again. A strand appeared before her, fine, silver, barely visible, vibrating gently. A summons. She took it between her fingers. It led her not into danger, but into song. The great hall of threads unfolded beneath her steps. She had only seen it once, in dreams whispered by the archive. Now it rose for her, a cathedral of memory, filled with those who had chosen to care, to act, to leap. They stood without masks, without names, but every one of them had once been Spider. Alara stepped into the center. A voice spoke, not from one mouth but from all. "It is time." "For what?" she asked. "For the next pattern." She hesitated. "What if I'm not the one to start it?" "You are not." A door opened, and a child walked through, eyes wide, thread pulsing at their wrist. No suit, no title, just wonder. Alara knelt and smiled. "What do you see?" she asked. The child looked up. Everything. And they took their first step into the weave. Because the web was not a story to follow. It was a place to begin, and someone always will. The web shimmered like dawnlight on water. The child walked forward, each step spinning new silk from beneath their feet, the threads catching not just their path but their intention. The great hall adjusted, walls widening, ceilings folding outward into starlit space, allowing the future to breathe. Alara followed at a quiet distance. She no longer led. She witnessed. Each new voice found its own resonance in the web. Some sang their thread aloud. Some whispered it into soil. Some danced it into existence without ever writing it down. No two patterns were the same. The child, whose name would not be revealed yet, for some names are earned in motion, paused beside the first mask. It pulsed softly as if to say, "I remember you already." They did not reach for it. They bowed. The archive recorded the moment as memory, not monument. And the city above felt the change ripple outward. Not a spider person born. A spider possibility awakened. In a garden woven into the side of the tallest tower, Miles taught new arrivals how to land without fear. Gwen helped construct a bridge of sound across an ocean, connecting two cities that had forgotten each other. Jessica wrote the first children's book where the spider never had to fight, only choose. Cindy returned briefly, smiling in a way only those who've touched too many timelines can. She handed Alara a folded thread. "Open it when the night sings," she said, then vanished. The city lived, not under protection, but in participation. There were still dangers, still bad days, still falling things, but the web no longer trembled. It flexed, adapted, reached. And in a quiet moment, as dusk folded over the rooftops and the stars rehearsed their nightly choreography, Alara stood at the edge of her home. The child, new to it all, stood beside her now. "Is it always this big?" they asked. "No," she said. "It's always bigger." They smiled. "Are you scared of that?" Alara looked out across the glowing silk threads. across the rooftops alive with voices and movement and hope. "No," she said, "it means there's more to tell, and someone always will." The web never ended, it unfolded. And on this evening, it unfolded gently. Alara stood beneath a canopy of glowing silk leaves, each one etched with a memory not yet told. The child sat beside her, legs crossed, eyes fixed upward at a sky speckled not just with stars, but with threads, glistening like rivers winding across infinity. They were waiting, not for danger, not for action, but for the telling. In front of them, a crowd gathered. Not a crowd of citizens, not of heroes, but of weavers. People of every kind, every form, every world. Some wore suits, some wore scars, some wore nothing but their truth. Alara stood. The archive echoed faintly behind her, glowing from within. She did not speak loudly. She did not need to. "This," she said, "is not my story." She looked to the child. "It's yours." They stood, uncertain at first, then steady. And with their first breath, the telling began. They spoke of a city they dreamed of, one where no one walked alone. They spoke of silk that carried memories like lullabies. They spoke of loss without bitterness, of strength without armor, of kindness as a choice, not an instinct. They wove a thread in the air with their hands, and it shimmered. From the crowd, others stepped forward. One painted a memory into the sky. One hummed a lullaby that echoed through dimensions. One simply placed a hand over their heart. Each gesture spun a thread. Each thread connected, and the web grew again. Not with legacy, with possibility. Alara stepped back. She was no longer the voice at the center. She was the silence that allowed others to speak. And as the sky filled with woven dreams and the ground beneath them pulsed with gentle light, the city listened. Every window open, every door unbarred. Because the web was not held by those who wore masks. It was held by those who remembered why the leap mattered. And someone always will. The story didn't end, it blossomed. Dawn touched the city like a whisper. Soft gold filtered through the threads overhead, casting long shadows that stretched into yesterday and into what would come next. Alara stood barefoot in a courtyard laced with dew-wet silk, its strands pulsing gently beneath her steps. Not surveillance, not alert, just memory softly stirring. The child had not stopped weaving since nightfall. They moved in loops, circles, spirals, drawing meaning not in words, but in motion. Every pass of their hands, every moment of stillness, added to the pattern. Around them, others joined. Some danced, some sang, some simply stood, letting the web pass through them, anchoring it with presence. Alara watched, smiling. The great hall no longer needed walls. It existed wherever someone chose to listen. From distant rooftops, gliders of woven thread launched skyward, carrying stories etched in silk to far-off cities and forgotten worlds. The archive no longer held everything, it shared it. And far beyond it all, in places where the web had once feared to reach, lights began to blink on. One by one. Not bright, but steady. Each a signal, I remember. In the silence between rhythms, Alara opened the thread Cindy had left her long ago. It didn't unfold like a message. It sang. A low, winding tone filled with gravity and tenderness. A song of origins not bound by tragedy, but choice. It was the lullaby of the first mask, the one who had first dared to say, I will protect them, before they knew what that meant. Alara let it carry her. Through memory, through wonder, through everything they had become. When she opened her eyes, the child was waiting, thread in hand, face calm. "What now?" they asked. Alara smiled. "Now," she said, "you teach me, because stories don't end when they're told. They end when they're forgotten, and someone always will." A quiet hush settled over the web, not silence, but reverence. Alara walked beside the child, who now led with the ease of someone not seeking to be followed, but simply being. The city greeted them not with fanfare, but with familiarity. Nods, open doors, thread lines drawn into chalk art and morning bread. At a crossing of woven footbridges, a new tower rose. Not high, not sharp, just tall enough to see the sky from its roof. Its walls were latticed with open air and silk glyphs, a structure meant to breathe. It was the Hall of First Threads. Here they gathered. Not the oldest, not the strongest, the firsts, the ones who began, who reached out before they knew what would happen, who fell and reached again. One by one, they placed tokens into the foundation. A frayed glove, a folded drawing, a broken web shooter, a journal with no name. Not relics, roots. Alara placed nothing. She knelt, hands in the earth thread, and let go. Not her power, not her role, her centrality. She became one of many, a node, a memory. The child stepped forward and spun a final line through the hall. It curved and danced, weaving through every object, every presence, every choice. When they were done, they turned and said only, "Now it can begin." A breeze carried the words into the archive, which opened its doors so wide the horizon bowed. Beyond it, new cities awakened, not cities of war or fear, but of possibility. And everywhere the web went, it hummed the same song. The leap was never the end. It was the first breath, and someone always will. The web stretched across the sky like morning light unfurling over water. Its strands no longer buzzed with warning, but with welcome. Alara stood on a quiet rooftop, gazing toward the east where thread gliders returned from long journeys. Each carried stories, not triumphs or tragedies, but truths, small, honest moments wrapped in silk and memory. The world was full, but never finished. Behind her, the Hall of First Threads pulsed with new voices. Elders came to learn, children came to teach, names no longer defined by origin, but by what they chose to carry forward. The archive had become a loom of many hands. She traced her fingers through a line of silk that hummed with laughter. Somewhere far away, someone had just told their first story aloud. And the web had heard. The child approached, no longer a child, not exactly. They had grown taller in motion, their thread woven into thousands of others, their presence as steady as a cornerstone. Alara smiled. "You're leading well." They shook their head. "I'm listening. That's what matters." Together they stood as the sky darkened gently, the city preparing not for fear, but for rest. Beneath them, spider symbols still adorned doorways, not as warnings or shields, but as welcomes, marks of presence, of legacy honored without being burdened. And as night fell, they saw it. A new star, not fallen, risen. A beacon blinking just once, enough for the web to catch and amplify. Someone somewhere had made a leap, not to save, to connect, and the web caught them. Alara exhaled, a laugh, a tear, a thread, because the story was not about being remembered. It was about remembering others. She looked to the horizon, where dawn would come again, and whispered, "Yes, because the thread is always there, and someone always will." Above the city, The web shimmered with quiet breath. Each strand pulsed in rhythm, not with conflict, but with connection. The archive had grown vast, no longer a tower nor a vault, but a garden. Memory bloomed here, not kept under lock and key, but rooted in shared soil. Each thread wove between lives like ivy on old stone. Alara knelt among the blooming coils of silk, guiding a new pattern into the loom. Not hers, but one offered by a passerby. A shopkeeper's story, a mechanic's melody, a quiet vow whispered by a commuter who once thought their morning silence meant they had nothing to say. Everything mattered. Everything wove. She stood and watched as a young pair of weavers, barely old enough to name their threads, rebalanced a silken bridge frayed by overuse. Not to preserve it, but to remake it stronger and stranger than before. The child, grown now, though still without a name spoken aloud, stood across from her beneath the archive's flowering arch. "We've stopped looking for beginnings," they said. Alara nodded. "Because we've learned that the thread doesn't start. It waits." And from behind them came the whisper of wings. A visitor, wrapped in starlight thread, landed without sound. Their suit bore no emblem, just texture, woven memories shaped into armor, soft and gleaming. They offered no name, no origin, only a thread. It glowed indigo at the edges. Alara reached out gently and felt its weight, heavy with sorrow, radiant with love. It came from a world none of them had seen, one where the leap had been made but never acknowledged, where kindness had not been forgotten, only unspoken. She placed it into the archive, and the garden bloomed again. A new color, a new tone. The visitor smiled and disappeared. Alara and the grown child watched in silence. Then the bells began. Low, clear, woven into the wind. Across the city, people looked up, not in fear but in readiness. Another voice was about to join. Another story was ready to be told. The web expanded, and someone always will. Twilight hung over the city like a soft shawl of memory. From balcony gardens and high-thread walkways, quiet voices rose, not in alarm, but in rhythm. Stories passed from hand to hand like small gifts. A grandmother's tale of lifting rubble with trembling arms. A child's drawing of a spider swinging between stars. A mechanic's laugh recorded in the haptic lace of their gloves. Alara listened to them all. She no longer needed to hold the web. She was held by it. The grown child, now called the weaver, walked beside her in silence. Their name had never been spoken because it had become unnecessary. The city didn't speak it. It lived it. From the garden roots of the archive to the tip of the furthest glider tower, the rhythm of life was not built around crisis, but around care. Even the stars had begun to respond. Alara noticed it one night, a slow rearrangement, constellations shifting to match patterns of connection. No longer Orion, but a mother catching her son mid-fall. No longer Ursa, but a circle of hands linked across dimension. The sky, too, had learned to listen. And then, one night, the sky spoke back. A single thread of silver light streaked from the edge of space, curling downward like a question. It did not burn. It shimmered. And when it touched the archive, it folded gently into a shape none had seen before. A cradle. Alara approached, heart silent. Within it rested a seed of thread, tiny, pulsing, pure, a gift from beyond. The weaver knelt beside her. "What is it?" they asked. Alara smiled softly. "A beginning, but not ours." They both stood back as the cradle shimmered, then unfolded into a distant song, one that echoed through the multiverse. Somewhere out there, someone had leapt for the first time, and the web had felt it. The city dimmed its lights to listen. No fireworks, no alarms, just welcome. Alara closed her eyes, and the seed pulsed once more, because the story never ends. It only finds new tellers, and someone always will. The night after the cradle arrived, the city held its breath, not out of fear, out of reverence. For the first time in years, the web shimmered with silence. Not stillness, but a pause. A breath drawn in unity. All across the archive and the garden towers, the threads held steady, listening. Alara sat beneath a canopy of starlight silk, her eyes closed. Not asleep, just attuned. Around her, others gathered, not in rows or ranks, but in circles. Circles within circles, spiraling out across the city like ripples across water. The cradle glowed at the center, and from within, the seed of thread had begun to unfurl. Tiny fibers spun outward, not seeking to connect, but to learn. They reached minds, not memories, intent, not identity. It was not building a hero. It was becoming a listener. The weaver stood beside it, palms open. Their thread, once bright and boundless, now braided into quiet equilibrium. "It doesn't want to be seen," they whispered. Alara nodded. "It wants to see." And so they waited, not to teach, to be observed. All day and all night, the city lived as it had always lived. People helping, failing, trying again. Bridges mended, laughter shared, tears met with arms wide open. And the threadling watched. It hovered through a bakery as the owner gave the last loaf to someone who couldn't pay. It drifted past a rooftop where two siblings fixed a broken glider with patience, not pride. It paused near a window where someone sat alone, unsure, yet still watching the sky. When dawn came, it returned to its cradle. Changed. Thicker, warmer, glowing faint gold. Alara approached, heart quiet. "It understands," the weaver said. "No," Alara whispered. "It remembers." And from within the cradle, a single thread rose, not to be grasped, but to be followed. Somewhere, someone was ready, not to wear the mask, but to weave it, and someone always will. In the quiet stillness of the multiverse, the echo of Alara's footsteps faded like a memory stitched into the seams of silk and light. There was no longer one spider, no longer one city, no longer one story. The web had made sure of that, and in its endless weave, new patterns continued to emerge. In a dimension where the sky was a deep coral hue and buildings bent in loops like Mobius strips, a spider named Kale drifted through the city without ever touching the ground. His threads were spun not from fluid or tech, but from the resonance of memory, snapping into place when someone felt forgotten, when hope had slipped through fingers. He did not swing. He floated, carried by the pull of the lives around him, like a compass turned inward. In another world, silent and still, blanketed in eternal snow, a young spider, called simply Ink, wrote her webs in glyphs, each line a question etched into the frost. She never spoke, but those who read her questions found answers within themselves. In a futuristic sprawl layered across 5 vertical cities, each stacked atop the next like the bones of a long-dead titan, a collective of spiders, once hackers, once rebels, now kin, wove digital webs across surveillance grids and neural feeds. They weren't trying to erase injustice. They were archiving it, preserving the truth before it could be rewritten. And through them all, Alara's voice sometimes passed. Not as command, not as prophecy, but as a whisper in the threads. Ask, witness, weave. The story of Spider-Man had never been about a single mask or even a single person. It had always been about the thread, the act of connecting across time, space, fear, joy, failure, and forgiveness. And so the web sang. Somewhere, a villain paused before pulling a trigger and remembered the look in a spider's eyes. Somewhere, a child caught themselves mid-fall and wondered how they landed so softly. Somewhere, a grandmother dusted off a photograph and saw, just beyond the reflection, a mask she once wore in dreams. There was no ending, only the next breath, the next thread, the next leap. And somewhere out there, even now, someone is making the choice. Not because they have to, because they can. Because someone always will. The wind howled high above Midtown, brushing past antennae and cooling units as if whispering to the ghosts of rooftops long forgotten. Miles stood at the edge of a news tower, toes curling over the concrete lip, eyes fixed on the city below. It had changed again. The skyline wore new scars. Construction cranes hovered like vultures over hollow towers, and billboards pulsed with unfamiliar code, symbols from languages not yet born in this earth. But Miles wasn't afraid. Not anymore. His suit shimmered subtly in the moonlight, the red veins of its design glowing faintly with each heartbeat. The mask was in his hand, not on his face. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked. Gwen emerged from the shadow of the rooftop vent, her own mask pulled back, blonde hair fluttering loose. "Yeah," she said softly, the hum, like the web's breathing. Miles nodded, like it's waiting. They didn't speak for a moment, not because there was nothing to say, but because what needed saying hadn't found words yet. Below, a car alarm warbled, a dog barked, a baby cried out for a moment, then was comforted. Normal things, fragile things. And above them, the sky shimmered, not with stars, but with cracks. Hairline fractures in the firmament, pulsing with prismatic energy. Time had not healed all wounds. Gwen finally broke the silence. Peter used to say, "The world doesn't need perfect people. It needs people who try." Miles smiled, turning the mask over in his hands. "Then maybe we try together." He slid the mask back on. The red eyes lit. Gwen did the same, and together they leapt. Not into battle, into possibility. And somewhere deeper still, beyond where even the web dared whisper, an echo stirred. Not a warning, a reminder that even endings had threads. A boy sat alone in a room filled with paper. Each sheet carried a sketch, a symbol, a suit. 1,000 variations, each imagined from nothing but memory and hope. He didn't remember where the images came from, only that he needed to draw them, night after night, until they became muscle memory, until they felt real. His parents thought it was a phase. His teachers marked him distracted. But something inside knew better, that these weren't inventions. They were remembrances, fragments of something forgotten by time, but not by soul. And one morning, without planning, he pulled a hoodie over his head, slid on battered sneakers, and stepped outside. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet did. Every step led to rooftops, alleyways, wind-slick water towers. He didn't leap, not at first, but he looked up, and the sky looked back. There was no radioactive spider, no lab accident, no cosmic anomaly, just a moment. And in that moment, the web noticed. Threads touched threads. The boy saw the city as it truly was, alive, aching, beautiful, unfinished. And somewhere in the archive, a new page wrote itself. Not a hero, not yet, but a spark. And across 1,000 worlds, 1,000 stories felt that spark ignite. There would be more villains, more falls, more sacrifice. But the boy didn't know that yet. All he knew was the wind felt right. And the story wasn't over. Not even close. The spider that had once crawled across Peter's hand long ago had never died. Not truly. It had become legend, memory, echo. Its bite had not just changed flesh. It had spun a thread that stretched across realities, pulling in others, each touched by chance or fate or science or myth. And in one such thread, far from the cities we know, a boy with silver eyes traced the pattern of a spider into the frost of a broken window. He had no name yet, just a number burned into his collar and the quiet resolve of someone who had already lost too much. But when he moved, the frost danced. In another thread, a grandmother in Oaxaca whispered stories of the spider and the jaguar to her wide-eyed grandchildren, painting with ink and fire across the walls of her hut. Outside, vines trembled, listening. The web reached them all, not to change their lives, but to notice them, to invite them, because the web had learned that connection was not about destiny, but acknowledgement. Peter Parker stood now on a rooftop that wasn't his, in a city that pulsed with colors unfamiliar. Behind him, dozens of others: Alara, Miles, Gwen, Paviter, even those without masks, without powers, the custodians, the archivists, the storytellers. They had all come to watch. Below them, the world wasn't ending. It was beginning. 1,000 spider people across the multiverse, not converging for war or judgment or triumph, but for listening, sharing, bearing witness. They had made it through collapse and confusion, through betrayal and loss. And now they were simply here. Alara stepped forward. "This world doesn't need a protector," she said. "It needs space to dream." So they left the city not in ruins, nor in glory, but intact. With its stories, with its contradictions, with its hope. And so, the web shimmered with fullness. Alara stood once more in the central spire of the archive, looking down at the silk-strewn city and out toward the infinite reaches where other threads danced. Her heart no longer beat alone. It echoed with generations before her, beside her, beyond her. A soft vibration rang out, not a warning, a call. Not to arms, to presence. She descended the spire, step by step, as the golden morning cut through the last of the mist. Faces greeted her with knowing eyes. The baker from Earth 9100, the musician from Earth 212, the blind dancer from the cracked dimension of echoes. Each nodded, not to her but to the moment. This was the first dawn without a spider. And yet, every shadow still held one. Every laugh, every shout, every open hand, spiderwork in motion. Alara stopped at a small courtyard where new initiates gathered. Children, teens, elders, some human, others not. They wore no masks. Their only uniform was wonder. She sat among them. No speeches, no scripts, just questions. What do you feel when you fall? What do you trust to catch you? The answers came not in words, but in drawings, in songs, in tears, in shared silence. A young boy held up a broken watch, his fingers trembling. "It stopped when my brother died. I still wear it. I don't want to forget." Alara only nodded. "Then it belongs here." And she showed him how to place it into the memory loom. As the thread accepted it, the loom pulsed. A ripple ran through the archive. A new pattern was forming, not from crisis, from continuity. Across the city, the streets began to shimmer faintly. The archive's heartbeat now moved into homes, into artwork, into stories told on stoops and rooftops and whispered across light years. And in the stars above, no longer constellations, but braids. Braids of lives chosen. Not destiny, participation. Spider-Man had never been a single story. It was a habit of courage, a culture of response, a celebration of falling and choosing to swing anyway. Alara closed her eyes. She heard laughter. She heard footsteps on glass. She heard 1,000 quiet voices choosing, again and again, to listen, to leap, to lift. And so the web expanded still, not as a singular thread, but a lattice, a dance, a symphony of motion and memory and meaning. On Earth 982, Mayday Parker, the daughter of Peter and Mary Jane, stood atop a ruined tower, her suit tattered from the battle with the inheritor Deimos. She stared into the sky, where threads shimmered in and out of perception. She smiled. She had seen too much to fear it anymore. She welcomed the pull. Elsewhere, in Earth 65, Gwen Stacy tuned her drums in a back room beneath the stage lights. Her senses tingled, not with danger, but with connection. The kind you feel when a friend you've never met thinks of you at the same moment. She struck the snare. The vibration danced into the web. From Earth 1048, Peter swung past a digital billboard flashing Jameson's rants. But this time, he didn't flinch. He waved at a kid wearing a hoodie with Miles' spray-painted symbol. The future wasn't just near, it was now. And on Earth 616, beneath the skyline of a New York rebuilt more times than it could count, an older Peter Parker stood on a rooftop watching two younger figures leap from fire escapes in tandem. He didn't correct them, didn't instruct. He simply watched, smiling, because the web no longer needed guardians. It needed gardeners. Somewhere deep in the beyond, in the cosmic quiet between stories, Madame Web closed a book that had no title. Her eyes, white and endless, blinked once. "Begin the next one," she said, and a thread twitched. A new name whispered into the skein. Somewhere in a small apartment in Brooklyn, a baby cried for the first time, and across the web, thousands of spider senses hummed like tuning forks. Not in alarm, but in welcome. A new weaver had arrived, and so the web remained open, not as a tear in space, but as a promise that every story mattered, that no voice, no thread, no small kindness was too small to echo. In a quiet burrow nestled beside the Atlantic, a new story began. It started with a fall. A boy 15, maybe 16, slipped off a roof chasing a drone. No powers, no plan, just reckless curiosity. And then something caught him. Not a hand, not a web, a net of light woven by the city itself, by the memory of a choice made 1,000 times before. He landed, breathless, laughing. "Did you see that?" He yelled to no one and everyone. And the city answered, in a hum beneath the pavement, a shimmer in the air. So, he didn't put on a mask that night, but he walked home slower, looking up more. And in a high tower far from Earth, in a place without day or night, Madame Web smiled. She had not woven this net. They had, all of them, every spider who had ever leapt, every person who had ever listened, every keeper of every moment. The web had grown beyond control, beyond prophecy. It had become us, and it would never stop growing. Because even when the mask was set down, the choice remained, and someone always will. And so it came to pass that the city breathed without panic. It wasn't peace, not in the way of perfect stillness. New villains would rise, petty crimes would occur, and hard choices would always remain. But the rhythm had changed. The city no longer held its breath, waiting for the next great fall. It exhaled, trusted. Across rooftops and high spires, figures still swung, still watched, still listened. But not in solitude, not in isolation. They moved like notes in a melody, improvising, harmonizing. Some wore suits, others didn't. Some bore the spider, others bore memory. Alara sat at the edge of a clock tower, the sun behind her casting long shadows over the tapestry of streets below. She no longer felt the tug of needing to be someone else. The archive thrived not as a vault, but as a garden. New stories sprouted every day, rooted in old ones, reaching forward. A young boy clambered up the stairs behind her, huffing. "You said this view changes things," he panted. She smiled, scooting aside to give him room. "Did I?" He looked out over the skyline, brows furrowed. "Doesn't look different. Still smog, still noise." Alara nodded. "But you're here now. That changes it." He blinked, unsure whether it was profound or nonsense. But he didn't press. He just watched. A thread unspooled from her finger, barely visible. She tied it to the railing beside her, a silent offering. The boy did the same. Below, in the heartbeat of the city, people moved unaware, but not unwitnessed. A call went out, not of warning, but invitation. Come weave, come remember, come matter. The web pulsed in rhythms too old for language, too vast for any one city. Somewhere above Earth, 8349, a moon shattered, and the shards formed a slow spiral, threads of silver light weaving themselves into orbit. From those drifting fragments emerged a figure in motion. Not swinging, not leaping, but skating across the vacuum, trailing strands of photonic web behind them like comet tails. This spider was born in zero gravity, raised between space stations and whispers of lost astronauts. They didn't speak much. They wrote, in orbits, in drift patterns, in gravitational poetry only a few could read. And in their quiet way, they kept entire colonies from unraveling. They were not alone. On Earth, 56, black, a world where noir never faded. Another spider crouched beneath a flickering street lamp, trench coat flaring like a second cape. He smoked metaphors more than cigarettes, and he bled meaning in monologue. But when push came to shove, he threw down with fists, words, and uncompromising moral lines. He never stopped looking for the kid who slipped through his fingers one rainy night. Above both, along the filaments of dimensional resonance, something older stirred. Not a villain, not a god, a memory. The memory of the first choice, the first fall, the first webcast not for survival, but for someone else. It was coming back. And those who had worn the mask across styles and species, across time loops and musical numbers, felt it, like a pressure drop before a storm, like a hand on the shoulder in a silent room. Something was changing, not ending, becoming. And across the multiverse, in whispered tandem, 1,000 spiders looked up, not toward threat, but toward wonder. Not asking, what now? But what next? The web no longer shimmered with urgency. It shimmered with invitation. In a quiet corner of Earth, 928, a spider known only as Echo traced fractal glyphs into the glowing pavement. Her web wasn't made of silk or tech. It was made of resonance. Each step she took sang softly in the language of vibration, calling forth memories hidden in the bones of buildings. People gathered, not to witness, to remember. Far above, In an observatory that blinked between realities like a firefly in the dusk, an ancient being watched. Madame Web, older now, her form dissolving gently into light, smiled without lips. "We are past the center," she whispered. "Now we ripple." And ripple it did. Across timelines, across cultures, across species. On Earth 505, where all speech had been replaced by gesture, a spider with 6 arms choreographed defense into dance. On Earth 0.1, where the planet floated in perpetual dream state, its spider did not swing or leap, they imagined. And through imagination, they saved. Peter Parker, in the prime of his age, read bedtime stories to his daughter. The tale wasn't about heroism, but about honesty. How the first mask wasn't fabric, but fear, and how courage was what came after. Miles painted a mural so vast it could only be seen from above. Gwen drummed a rhythm that pulsed through 100 alleyways. Alara planted a thread seed beneath a tree and watched as it flowered in real time, blooming into a story before sunset. And all the while, the web didn't tighten. It loosened. It gave room. Not every spider would leap from danger. Some would leap from hope. Some would leap just to see if others might follow. Because now, the web wasn't about holding things together. It was about letting them grow. And someone always will. And somewhere, a single thread sang alone. It stretched not from crisis, not from memory, but from curiosity. In Earth AU'd at N9, a world still in its first stories, a young girl crouched beside a puddle, watching the distorted reflection of her face shimmer. Her village didn't have towers. No heroes flew. But when she reached into the water and pulled free a single strand of light, she knew. Not who she was, but who she might become. She spun the thread between her fingers like it was silk, though it held no weight. It tugged gently, leading her not to danger, but to discovery. A hill, a voice, a question. And when she answered, the thread pulsed. The web had found her. Not because she was strong, but because she noticed. The final pattern had begun to weave. Not a climax, not a battle, not a conclusion, a continuation. Peter Parker sat at the edge of a quiet rooftop, watching traffic lights flicker below. His knees ached more now. His webs didn't always fire straight, but his smile, that remained sharp. He pulled out a notebook, leather-bound, worn. Inside were names, not villains, not allies, just people. People he'd seen, helped, listened to. At the bottom of the page, he scribbled something new. It's not about being remembered. It's about remembering others. He tucked the book away and stood. Somewhere a bell rang. Somewhere a mask was lifted, not for battle, but to be passed forward. And in the heart of the archive, in the root thread where all stories touched, the loom spun gently on. The web remained open, because someone always will. It was quiet now, not because the story had ended, because the story had become. In the spaces between action and memory, in the hush of twilight between leaps, the web held its breath, not from fear, but reverence. Somewhere far beyond the multiverse's charted edge, a new loom spun itself without hands, made not of silk, but of story, not of spiders, but of possibility. Alara stood before it, older now, lines traced across her face like gentle maps. She did not wear a suit. She wore a shawl of threads gathered from every story she had ever touched. She reached out not to control it, to thank it, and the loom responded. It wove her name into its roots, not as a title, but as a moment. The final line, and a beginning. Below, the archive sang, not as a monument, as a cradle, Children leapt between rooftops, not to chase danger, just to feel the wind. Elders told stories of the times the sky cracked and the city wept, and how people chose each other again and again. The web had no center now, because the web was everywhere. In laughter, in effort, in apology, in risk, the mask was never the point. The choice always was, and someone always will.